Well, let me go ahead and start the notes as well. All right. I suppose I have things on the agenda. So I'll start with the first one. I think there's a PR needing a second SMC approval, which I don't see any on the call. But if anyone wants to take a look at it, it's the idea of adding an order to an individual aggregate measure. So typically aggregate functions don't depend on the order. Otherwise, they would be window functions. But there are a few aggregate functions which are kind of somewhere in between. So array aggregate is one of them. It takes all of the inputs and then emits one row, but that row is an array value. And so it's basically just kind of unnesting. It takes a column of data and turns it into a single row. But the order in which the values go into that array would depend on the order in which the aggregate is run. So some SQL dialects and engines will allow you to express an ordering for individual measures, which is what the PR is for. But I mean, it looks pretty straightforward to produce, if maybe not terribly straightforward to consume. But I don't see anyone else on the call for that, so we can probably move on unless anyone wants to mention anything about it. Okay. The other item I had written was expand versus unnest. I sent this to the mailing list as well, so I'm just interested in hearing kind of any feedback on this topic. This started out as there was a PR originally written, I believe by the people who were working on the gluten, to add expand to substrate, because expand is a logical relation in Spark. And so if we can add it to substrate, we can have kind of the complete set. And while I was investigating it, I discovered that some engines have expand and others use unnest, where Spark would use expand. So expand is a relation that takes every input row and emits a number of output rows. So you might have one input row. For each input row, you might emit 4 different output rows. And each output row is slightly different according to basically some instructions that are in the expand relation. Essentially, you can kind of think of it as 4 different project expressions that all get union together, or any number of project expressions that get unions together. This is useful for implementing both unpivot, or what TidyR would call pivot longer, and it's useful for, it can be used to calculate rollup aggregations. So if you have a rollup aggregation, you can expand the input and put nulls in the right columns, and then you just feed it into a normal aggregate row or node, and you would get the rollup aggregation as a result. So I believe Spark uses it for both of those things. DuckDB and Data Fusion and Postgres all use unnest instead. So unnest is not at the highest level, the most logical kind of in the SQL level. Unnest looks just like a function. It's a function that takes in like an array of t, and it returns type t. So usually when it's kind of be doing the same thing as expand, you're taking in like a constant array. So you take an array of like 3 values, and maybe it's, column 0, and null. And so then it's going to emit 3 different output rows for every input row, and they'll have column 0, and null. So the resulting behavior that you get is very much similar to expand. There's some weird rules around what happens with like nulls, and implicitly kind of if you have 2 columns that are both calling expand, they sort of work together. Sorry, both calling unnest, they sort of work together. So anyway, these are 2 approaches to solving more or less the same problem, which is you take in one row and you emit a number of output rows. So we could either adopt both approaches, or we could kind of pick one and centralize on one. And I'm open to, whatever anyone thinks would be a good idea. So at this point, just seeking feedback. I kind of wrote all this up in more detail in a document. So I'd encourage anyone to look at it and give some feedback.
So if we only adopt one, does it make it really hard for, let's say we just did do a nest. How is Spark going to actually end up working? Because it would have to do a conversion step.
So unnest is the slightly more flexible one. So you should always be able to convert from expand to unnest. So Spark could take an expand relation and it could turn it into a project relation with the appropriate unnest calls. Going the other way is not guaranteed to be possible.
Which is the way that Spark would end up going, right? Because they would have somebody might provide an unnest, and then you'd want to use it on Spark, and then you wouldn't be able to use Spark because you wouldn't be able to convert the unnest into their expand.
I think the goal for Spark is to be able to go in both directions. So someone might start with Spark. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say it feels a lot like the in or thing, right? Like you can express a list of constant equality conditions, a equals 5 or a equals 10 or a equals 15 as basically an or list, like a list of or expressions with equalities, right? But we also have the or list expression type, right? Which is another way to express the same concept. And I think that the thinking there is that it's non-trivial to get from one to the other. It's not that it's not possible. And it's the same with actually some of the deconstructions around the correlated, or that's just the subqueries in general, that you could collapse into a more foundational primitive that would support a wide range of things, but it would be non-trivial to get from each of those independent concepts to this sort of generified concept, lowest common denominator concept. And my inclination is to apply the same rule here, which is that there's enough pain to go from unnest to expand and then back again. Right, because the moment you're talking about, I'm going to have to look across a couple of relations and then figure out if I can consolidate those into a single relation. My inclination is that we would probably just have both. And at some point, we want to get to the place where we have some rules that let you get from one to the other. But forcing the edge APIs to require someone to convert from one to the other seems a little burdensome. It's not horrible, but it's not as bad as some of the other patterns where, like, decorrelation. Like, we could just say that we didn't have correlated subqueries. We just decorrelated everything. That would be a freaking nightmare. It's not as bad as that, but yeah, my inclination is that if there's several systems that use the pattern, right, and there's some, obviously there's systems that are more important than others, right? Like data fusion is less influencing, in my opinion, than Spark, right? Just because the adoption is different, right? But if there are several systems or serious systems that use a particular pattern, I think we should be okay. If it's like, you remember, like when we were first working on the expand stuff, right? It was trying to get to a place where it was, I don't want to build stuff custom for individual systems. I want it to be explainable outside the context of that, understanding that system. And I think that's where we had to take expand. I think originally it was kind of very much built like the Spark representation of that concept. And then we got to one, I think, that was much more sort of like understandable outside the context of Spark. But having two things that are express equivalent concepts in different ways seems okay to me, as long as there's enough use of both of those patterns. That's my vote. Not having spent a lot of time looking at unnest, but like my assumption is unnest is similar to a flat or a lateral explode. Basically just takes a single an array and turns it into multiple rows. And so the pain part right there is that like in the context of trying to make it map to expand, you have to first convert things into arrays, which
yeah. So in expand, you have these switching columns, which have expression for, like maybe 4 different expressions. And then unnest, you would have an unnest function call, and you would have a constant argument, which is an array that has 4 different expressions in it.
Yeah. Yeah, but the two are separate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
what do others think?
I mean, both sounds fine to me as well. I guess I would have a follow-up question too, which is unnest is not a scalar function, but all these functions kind of just look like functions. Should it be introduced as a new type of function, or just pretend to be a scalar function, or what?
I mean, to me, the definition of a scalar function is that I output the same number of rows as I input. And so the moment you're not doing that, then I think it's a relation. That's my I'm a SQL guy, right? But like that's my mental model is that like the moment like window functions are this weird pseudo functions because they have purview over many rows, right? But they effectively are one row in, one row out, but with context, if you will. And so that's why I feel like it's kind of okay to have them. But as we mostly know, like the moment you actually want to get to a physical level with window functions, you actually break them into relations. And so I think that I don't think that a function can change. It seems weird if the function could change the cardinality of the output of a product operation.
Yes, sometimes the SQL just have a function, but under the hood, you add a relation, like in explode in Spark. You see a function, but it puts the function in the relation, right? So
from the protobuf standpoint, does it really matter that we put stuff under something called scalar function? I mean, if it was just called function, wouldn't it just, I don't think it would really matter to the engines. Is that just something, it's a convenience for us thinking about it?
So the part that gets confusing to me is once you start having trees of expressions. So like the one that's very easy, I think, to understand in my mind, but then weird to express is, select 1 plus max of x plus 1. So you have a scalar function calling an aggregate function calling a scalar function. And when you actually break it down into a logical plan, you're probably looking at 3 different relations, your input project, your aggregate, and then your output project. But in Substrate, I believe aggregate functions are part of expression trees. No? Okay.
Yeah, no. So that would have to be two relations in Substrate. I mean, I haven't worked with the algebra very recently, but my recollection is sort of my mental model, which a lot of stuff came from originally, is that aggregates are the expression that doesn't actually sit in the normal expression union, or whatever it's called, for exactly that reason. And so when you define measures in an aggregate function, the root of the measure must be a aggregate function. It cannot be a scalar function. And in the case of a project operation, the root has to be a scalar function. It can't be an aggregate function. Or anywhere in the tree can't be an aggregate function inside of a scalar. Yeah, and so that was to avoid. So yeah, so in that case that you just described, you can express, sum of x plus 1 in an aggregate expression tree, because anything inside the aggregate can be an arbitrary scalar. But then you're correct that the x plus 1 on the outside, or the sum plus the 1, or whatever it was, needs to be a project afterwards.
Okay. And then to answer your question, David, there is, as Jacques was pointing out earlier, we don't make that distinction with scalar and window functions. So both scalar and window functions are part of expression trees. But it is important, I think, for an engine to be able to distinguish between the two of them. And you can assume, at the end of the day, when it gets to the engine that's actually going to fulfill the query, it probably knows, because it's just going to look at the name and say, oh, this is a, rank. This is going to be a window function because I look it up in my, dictionary functions. But I think for like middle components, planners, things like that, which might not have access to all of the functions necessarily that the end consumer is going to have, it would be useful for them to know, so they can know that these two things are actually probably going to need to be handled differently.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that happened early, David, was there was discussion of whether, like, I think because we're all programmers, there's a tendency to say, oh, let's just, like, a relation and a scalar operation are both just functions. You take some inputs and then you return some outputs, right? You kind of generalize this, or sort of generalize it down to its like primitives. And there was kind of a conscious decision to say, you know what, like in the actual domain that we're in, those are really different things, and it's helpful to actually keep them separate, even if fundamentally they both get down to what are effectively just two different kinds of functions. One takes in a set, one kind of function takes in a set of things and returns a set of things. Another kind of function, at the programming level, takes in a single value, or a collection of values, and returns another collection of values, right? They're both, from a programming perspective, functions, but we said, you know what, in this place, let's keep them separate. And so I think saying that like it's all a little bit like arbitrary, right? Because what's the difference between a set and an array of objects, right? Like really nothing, except that most systems operate on those things very, very differently, right? Like most systems will treat a single scalar object, which is an array of objects. They'll expect to hold it all in memory at one time, right? They'll always work on it all together. Whereas most systems will treat a set as something that is a stream that they may be only working on a window of that whole set at a particular time. So, yeah, but I mean, I think it's a useful distinction, but it is a little bit an arbitrary distinction. I'm super confused by the comment. Yeah, the first item on the list. I have to go look at that PR about the ordering stuff, because I felt like we already solved this. So I guess I was looking at the what is it called? The doc, the agenda doc.
Ordering within, I can talk on it some more. So these are aggregate functions that happen to depend on the order of the input, which there's not a lot of them, but there's a few of them, and array ag is one of them.
Yeah, what I'm confused by is I thought we already had to solve this problem. So I'm confused by the, I think it's an aggregate function invocation.
There is a function invocation, but it's just an enum, and I don't know that I understand entirely what it does. There's unspecified, all, and distinct.
Yeah, there's that one, but I thought there was.
There's a
Sorry.
phase. Yeah, no, it's okay.
Just,
Oh, there is a repeated sort field sorts. But am I on a branch or? I think you might be right. There's an aggregate function has a sorts column.
yeah, no,
But
I
it's
mean, I
not
think when I was
per
working on it
measure.
originally, I was thinking about this scenario when I was building it. So that's what's confusing me. I'm like, I thought I did something with this.
Okay, but the aggregate function call is per measure. Yeah, so you might be right. I can look into that further. I was just looking at the aggregate route.
Yeah, no, because yeah, I remember us talking specifically about this thing, but I unfortunately don't remember a lot about it. Yeah, okay, so aggregate function, yeah, sort fields. Yeah. Yeah, so it's I think maybe just on a different level and people didn't see it.
So then we probably need to update the documentation to make it easier to find for these users.
Totally agree. Yeah. I mean, it's in the file. It's in the aggregate function. It's called sort field. It has a description around it saying, hey, if you want to order the aggregate records. But I agree with you that people failed to find it. So we obviously needs to be better.
We could add a small comment in the aggregate rel itself that in the measure section where they were thinking of adding this sort of like, by the way, you can sort these measures as part of the aggregate function, but maybe that's a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Like at some point, we'll probably remove a bunch of documentation, but right now having extra seems like a good idea. Like, anybody's gonna complain about that. I'm trying to remember why it was that we put the filter in one place and the sort in another, and I can't recall. I know that the filter came after the sort. That makes, I mean, yes, it's a hard one. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's probably why people didn't find it, because they saw the filter, they thought of the sort and the filter as being like two things of similar level of hierarchical sort of concept.
Yeah, but like you said, I don't think it's broken. We can document our way around this.
Yeah. And then you started a conversation about relations and when we should add them, which is in my list of emails to look at and respond to. Do you want to talk about any of that here?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I believe, kind of collecting from memory a conversation we had on this in this forum a few weeks back, which was what are the criteria that people can expect if they want to make a change to the core kind of substrate protofiles. It's just laying down some expectations of you need to have thought about this from multiple engines. You need to have translated this into substrate terminology. It'd be good if you can provide what some of the alternatives are and some examples and so on. So laying some guidelines for future contributions, I think, to hopefully avoid some of the challenges we've run into before, which is when people say, oh, this is missing from my engine, and then they create a PR for it immediately, and then it doesn't immediately get a ton of feedback because no one understands what it's talking about.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. The only question I have as I was looking at that as you're talking is that I'm not sure that it's unique to relations. It may be that relations is the place where we have the most problem with it right now. Like challenge, just like people not having the same vocabulary and trying to come to a shared consensus. But it's kind of true for all this stuff, I think. So just like I'm fine with it just being something that we initially focus on relations because that's the problem area. But like I was like, it's kind of true for everything, right? Like if someone wants to go like, hey, we should introduce this new function or function option or something like that, right? It's the same kind of thing, which is like, hey, what does this mean? How would someone else use it? Some stuff's super obvious, and so that stuff I think doesn't get enough. We don't spend a lot of time talking about like what add means because we all kind of know what add means. But then I think when other stuff comes in that's much more unusual, then there's probably less. I think that's probably part of what we're seeing is that people look and they say, well, there isn't that much documentation about project. And so why does there need to be a lot of documentation about expand? They're similar levels of things. The person is probably similarly familiar with both of them. And so I think it may be that people are not necessarily aware. If you've only worked on one system, you may not be as necessarily aware of the fact that the way that system does it isn't the way that necessarily all systems do it. But I generally support the effort question.
Yeah, and I think that's the basic idea of what I was trying to get across. Though it is difficult, I think, for many people because they only work on one system. How do you find out how people do things in different systems? But I was hoping to try and express that in email too, which is just ask here. We have hopefully people that work on a variety of systems here, and they can say, that sounds a lot like this thing we do over here in this way.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, no, I actually, when I read the last point you had, which is like, don't go alone, I'm like you said, I said, you don't have to go alone, I think is what you said on your thing. And I was thinking to myself, really, it's like, don't go it alone. Like it's, it's like one of those things, it's like collaborate with the other people in the community because like you're going to have a much higher likelihood of success.
Is there anything like an SLA for these changes? How long should changes?
We're missing it. I know that whatever the SLA is that we're not achieving it. I can guarantee that.
Yeah, because there's probably two of them, right? There's probably how long till the first response and initial discussion, and then probably one till how long it takes until we either completely reject it or act or merge it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not sure that that's the problem. At least in the ones that I can think of, like expand as an example, right? Like the reason that expand died on the vine from my point of view was we asked to have the documentation improved because it wasn't expressing a number of things. And then they were like, yeah, if you want it improved, do it yourself. I don't know who actually said that. But, and then like, it kind of falls to Western or me to be like, okay, well, I guess I'm gonna have to sit down and spend some time writing the documentation for this new relation. And then it's like, oh, well, when am I gonna schedule that, right? Like, when am I gonna, like, how important is this to me? Not really at all. It's not, I mean, I want the community to be successful, but at the same time, like it's so off topic from what I'm focused on right now. And so I think that's where it's harder when you're asking the community, when you're asking someone, a volunteer, to do some of the work for you. That's where it's like, it's one thing to review something, it's another thing to say like, okay, let me pick this up and shepherd it to success. I think it's unfortunate, right? Like I feel like these are classic examples of things where like, if Weston or I had probably spent another hour on that PR, we could have gotten it over the finish line. And instead, we got busy doing other things and it kind of just sat there and died on the vine. But yeah, I don't know. Do other people think that the problem is lack of responsiveness of reviewers? on feedback and or merging. Because I think that underlying what you said, David, is I think that suggestion. And I'm like I know we're not doing great at it, but I'm not sure that that's what actually killed these relation incorporations.
I agree that might not be what killed these things, but I do think there is a perception that things get stuck in review.
Yeah, that's fair. You know, Victor keeps beating me up. Hey, review my patch, which works actually, which I hate. I hate that it works, but it does. he figured out that if he slacks me directly, he gets more responsiveness, and so then all of a sudden I get pings. Ding.
Part of having a criteria, I think too, that I wanted was sometimes when I look at these things for review, it's just like, I don't like it, but I don't know why I don't like it. And that's the hardest thing to review, because you don't want to just say, no. That's not constructive. So if we get some of these criteria nailed down, I'm hoping it will be easier to say, no, this isn't considering things from multiple engines perspective. Why don't you ask for more help on the mailing list? Or no, the terminology here seems very specific to where you're coming from. And I've been, yeah, so, and, you know, as Jacques said, sort of jokingly, I think we do welcome if people are feeling frustrated, just ping on Slack. You don't have to necessarily directly message people, but if you throw it in the general channel or whatever and say, hey, I feel like this isn't getting any attention, then that can help.
Actually, the benefit of a low activity Slack channel is messages have, you know, like you actually see messages. Like I'm on the DBT Slack. I don't know if you guys have ever been there, but like it's like roughly 10,000 messages a day. It's like Twitter. There's like, I don't know, there's 50,000 people on DBT Slack or something ridiculous thing. It's like, this is impossible. I don't know what's going on.
The other one I currently think of that's just sort of sitting there is the one for, I guess, for DDL or something like that. It's sort of out there, sort of one, it's sort of sitting and not progressing.
Is this the one to connect the existing DDL things into the top level relation one of?
Yeah, somehow, I think.
So before we get into that, I have a suggestion here, because I think that one of the things that I started to try to do, like maybe 6 months or a year ago, and I kind of didn't make a lot of progress on, I think it would be helpful. I'm putting this out there. I'm like, is this going to be helpful or not? Question mark. Being clear about what the state of a PR is, I think, is something that might help us a little bit around perception, and also make sure that we're focusing on things that need focus, right? And so, as an example, right, like to me, the explain relations is in a state of changes requested, like if you will, like if, or I don't know what the right verbiage is, but it's basically like, this is an incomplete patch. It has issues with it that need to be addressed by the author or by someone else in the community, right? So that there's no expectation of like, oh man, they're just not merging my shit. You're like, yeah, it's not going to be merged because it needs to be fixed, right? Which is very different to me than something where, hey, you know, it's awaiting, you know, like Weston's original title on the other ticket was needs more approvers, right? Like, you know, like that's a very different kind of patch. Like we think that this is ready, but we need to have a couple more eyes on it, right? And so I do have a little bit of a question of whether or not being a little bit clearer about these things, and really like, I mean, to Weston's, I have similar feelings to Weston, where you're like, you don't want to just say like no to patches, But I think that like the flip side is that like having patches out there which you're never going to accept open puts a perception on that like you're unresponsive to things. When you're just like, hey, we should just close this shit, right? Like to me, there's probably a reasonable argument that we should go through the 28 open pull requests and close half of them, right? And then tag or label or apply the review approve request changes or whatever, so that there's a really clear status. Because I think that part of the problem I have sometimes when I get back into like, okay, I'm gonna spend 2 hours reviewing Substrate stuff, right? Is I'm just like, oh, what is going on? And where do I need to focus? And so you just start like at the top of the list and you go down a few and you get through 4 or 5 and then you wander off to do something else. And so like if this particular item, right, like this, the DDL thing is like, like I don't know what the status is without having to go through the whole PR, right? And so do other people think that that would be at all helpful? Or do you think that that's just make work?
So I think context in these things is always more helpful. In this case, it does require more work, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if this weren't like a spec, you'd be like, one of the cues you get is like, it's not even passing CI. I don't need to spend time on this right now. Or, like that's not going to be here. Passing CI on Substrate is not particularly difficult. It's do the docs build. You need to really mess it up. So like we can add some labels and things, but then it sort of becomes incumbent on whoever the first reviewers are to make sure they've added labels that kind of like reflect the current state after they have made a pass. And then also requires us to the people that check back in, be like, hey, I pushed some changes. Like I turned off the emails for like pushes a long time ago. So I mean, it'll be imperfect because all systems are. I mean, I think it's probably not a bad idea to try it, at least to have a sense. I definitely agree we should go through and close at least half the PRs that are open. And it's not about attacking people's ideas or personhood. It's just they're not going to get merged, and so we shouldn't lead them along, and we shouldn't lead ourselves along.
Actually, it's funny because that one that David was just talking about, the CLA is still not signed.
Well,
That would be a useful bot, actually. That, I mean, usually I don't like bots for a lot of these things. That like
that is a bot.
Great.
It's the very first
the CLA is.
comment.
I mean, yeah, if the label is there, I mean, but if like a label and like on the view of PRs, right? You don't even need to click through then.
Yeah.
I think it needs some shepherding a little bit to get it into the right place as well. But it's and I've put some comments and tried to get it changes, but I don't think they're been, I guess, totally responsive, except for pinging people in Substrate and whatever. But
yeah, well, and it's also interesting because I am about 80% sure that we had a patch that was really close to reasonable that already was solving this.
yeah, I think there was, and there is another one. And I would like to see one of the two remerge just because it makes sense for the right relations to actually be expressible in a plan.
Yes, that's a crazy idea, but not a bad one.
Unless you want to create a right plan, right?
Well, so let me ask you a question there, David. So you know that there are two of these things. How comfortable do you feel to shepherd this? Because I kind of feel like when you're saying that someone needs to shepherd it, you're saying it can't be me, and which is okay. You say I'm not comfortable with it, or alternatively, this is the stuff that I need help with. Because part of the problem, right, is that like, Weston's doing like 90% of the shepherding, and everybody else is doing like 8 or 9%. I'm helping 1% of the time, and so we need more shepherds. Like that's part of the problem, right? Is we need more shepherds, right? And so are there particular things that give you pause to say like, hey, I think this is a bad idea or this is a good idea? Is it, the comfort with the domain? Is it that like you feel like people just shoot you down all the time? Like thoughts?
I think I could probably come up with something I liked for this particular solution if I just said, forget these other two, or maybe I'll look at these other two. But I think I could get them into a place that everybody would be happy with. Instead of trying to work through them to just do it myself, I guess, I think would be a whole lot faster.
Well, that's the way to get rid of all the different competing standards, right? Is to create a new one. So
exactly, and I think that's yeah, I think I could do that, and I think if maybe that's enough to Shepard. It's like, hey, this is what I would make it look like, and then see if I can get some agreement on it. So I think in this particular case, I probably have enough knowledge to make it to make a competing standard that I think will work, that everybody will like. Just because most of the time, most of the requirements people want is I just want it in.
yeah, well, I think I mean, my recollection is that it's just missing from the union.
Yeah.
Like literally, I think that it's like a one-line change to put it in the union, and then you can have it in plans.
Yeah, I mean a little bit of documentation. The one that the most recent one wants to add a little bit more information. But so I guess it's slightly different. But so maybe there are two things going on here. But yeah, I think I could probably do something like that and see if we can get these things through. I can try to push these through.
I'm curious now. Is this someone on your team, Martin?
Sorry, who?
No, Mosh.
Mosh, yeah. I don't
No, it's like actually it's a competitor.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. It's just I saw him writing, so and then I went to my bosses and they said, yeah, we know them. It's a slightly different approach, but yeah.
very, very good. I just saw the name and I was like, that might be someone over there. I don't know.
Yeah, they're in Tel Aviv. It's not far, but
yeah, fair enough. Very good. Well, you can tell your team that they're not nearly as responsive in the community as you are. So you're more well respected.
Yeah, I did say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so David, I mean, that'd be my main thought is that like really the ask is for everybody to feel empowered to try to help move things along, right? And sure, we're gonna have places where we don't agree on stuff, but like that, like I think that the review speed will most impacted by that. So going back to the label stuff, right? Does anybody want? I hate asking for volunteers because that usually just means like, hey, like communities can talk all day about great ideas that no one's going to do. Maybe I'll try to find some time the week after next to go through the PRs. So anyway, my ask would be is of everybody to, hey, if you want to take a slice of PRs and just try to triage them and be like, hey, I propose that we close these 4, or if everybody just looked at 4 PRs, ideally not the same 4, so pick 4 random ones. Then we could probably get down to a smaller set. And then if you want to just, like, to me, it's like, don't feel like you need permission. Like if you want to create some labels because you think it'll just be helpful because you're like, oh, these 3 seem to be in the same state, like create a label, right? And we can do this organically, and at some point we can start to try to consolidate it. Like trying to come up with the like perfect system ahead of time that we're all going to agree on. Like good luck with the focus everybody has. But yeah, I think that would be my thought is that maybe what we do is we say, hey, because I think that like one of the things that happens with PRs, I've seen this multiple times, is that once there's enough PRs, it's just exhausting to go even look at the list. And that actually decreases like the likelihood of reviews. So getting to a short PR list that's reasonably categorized so that, if someone does have an hour, they go and say, oh, okay, well, these 3 actually need to be reviewed. Those 5 are sitting there waiting for, changes, or, like they're not even passing tests. Let's just not worry about them or whatever.
I believe you need certain permissions to be able to create and or apply labels in GitHub. I think.
So- So if we have, oh, the apply is the problem. If it create, wouldn't be too bad because we could just Slack check and then then they get created.
Hey, there's lots of people who have permissions. It's not just me. I think that anybody who's a committer should have maintenance position permissions, which I assume would mean create and apply labels.
Committers have the permissions. We've got at least 2 people on this call that aren't. Although I think Substrait is coming up, so
yeah. So if you want to create a label and you can't, just like ping channel in Slack and say, hey committers, can someone create a label for me so I can like whatever, like or just ping them on the PR. Be like, hey, I think this should have this, and like Weston, hey Rich, like there's a lot of committers, like so like just pick a random selection of them and say like, hey, can one of you like add a label to this?
And even if someone is new, there is a like some Apache projects have a contributor role, which is they don't have write privilege, but they have labeling privileges, and you basically just ask and get it.
That sounds good too. If you want, like I have not spent time understanding the permission scheme of GitHub. That's a possibility, but that's a possibility. I'm super supportive of that.
Okay, I think we can do that. If anyone wants labeling privileges, send me a message or put a message in Slack, and I will figure out how to make it work.
You got to go the other way around, Weston. I'm going to give labeling privileges to everybody I know that would be helpful doing labeling.
Yeah.
Hey, David, I'm going to get you labeling privileges.
Thank you.
So once you put a label, the label should expire at some time, right? Like if I say this is a work in progress and after 2 months also it's work in progress, I'll put a dirty flag somewhere, right? That I touched it in June and I touched it in July. I'm just playing devil's advocate here, or we do it every month, like first week of every month we triage the PRs and refresh the labels.
Gil's commentary. So it's like Mystery Science Theater 3000. I think that Ashford, I kind of agree with Gil, which is that like let's just start out by just trying to get people to start to clean up the PRs and get more organized around them. My expectation would be is if we start finding labels useful, then we'll probably set up some bots to like just say like, hey, if this hasn't been changed in 2 months and it's sitting in this state, then just close it out. And things like that. Actually, I like that better with bots because then it doesn't feel like being such a dick. Right? Like you just close something out, they're like, well, I hate that person because that person just closed something. It's a bot. You're like, okay, the bot does it. It's annoying still, but you're like, it's weird because
it doesn't feel personal.
Yeah, it doesn't feel personal. I remember actually, like I marked something that I wanted to see with a Google project, and I want to say I marked it like like a watch or something like that 15 years ago. And then like a year ago, like it closed as like, we're not going to do this. And I, like what technology I was looking at, I think it was Google Web Toolkit. I think it was something on that, which like, talking about technology like 15, 20 years ago. Yeah. So the stuff that's around for a long time just makes no sense. So having a bot at some point makes sense, but let's just try to get stuff organized a little bit more first.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea generally. I was just making sure that we understand the other side.
I want people to start abusing us that way, right? Like trying to keep their patch open. Like, great, let's have that problem. Look at the other one right now, which is that they post a patch and then they disappear. And you're like, what? This is a good idea. Let's collaborate on the finish. Anything else anybody wants to talk about?
Do we have time for Spark a few minutes?
Oh yeah, Spark, man.
Yeah, so last time we decided to send an email to the Boon guys. I think we confirmed what we knew, that the logical part they don't care about, they left it, right? And the other parts they're still working on. I could not understand what their plans are about the contribution, like putting any of it in Substrate. So this is what I understand from them. From our side, we are working pretty hard now to just switch to Substrate completely in our system. So what we have to do is to implement tons of stuff on top of what they did, only in the logical part. Like I said, this is what we're interested in. So I guess after we're finished, we'll have it's like a quite of a fork from their work with many additions. Some of it is a little bit quick and dirty, but I guess won't be too hard to fix. So from our perspective, we can use that as the first push, and we said we want to do it in the Substrate Java, right? So I think in a few weeks we will be ready, but I did not understand from them if that will be okay with them.
Let's just ignore them. That's my vote.
Okay,
like,
so
yeah, but like I mean, it's Apache licensed or whatever, a permission license of some sort, like, and they just don't like. I mean, I feel like several of us asked this question multiple times. Like, we have every legal right to just go and use the code, so it's like whatever. We're just trying to be like good citizens, but like,
okay,
I would just say, like, I mean, I'm super supportive if you post a patch today that's like, hey, here's an extraction of this portion of the stuff that we're going to continue to maintain. Like let's get it merged and continue to iterate on it. I don't know, Weston, if you have a different opinion.
I think part of the goal is to avoid them, like if we, yes, fine, let's do that. And then once that's done, I think we should still make an effort to get that updated merge stuff brought back into Gluten, so that they're not relying on a fork. But it sounded like you said that they're not worrying about the logical plan anymore. They're doing something else.
Yeah, they're not doing that. They don't use it in any other part of the project. It's like a completely separate part.
Okay.
And this is also this is what they said on the email, but you can see it also in the repo. So, but they did say something about in the future maybe they will have time, but they couldn't really understand exactly what they mean. So yeah, so we're doing quite a lot of work there. If you guys think we can start making an effort to contribute, okay, we'll have time in a few weeks, I guess. So this is one thing. Another thing is what we discussed, I think, 2 times, like two meetings back, about the extension of expression. So we already did it internally. We can try and also it would be even better to do the first contribution with something small. So I guess sometimes in the near future we can also do that. We have some problems with that, of how to use that in a generic way. What we're trying to do is to put for every expression, no matter what the type is, to add the extension. And we had a few problems with that to make it generic in the gluten part, in the Substrate Spark, when using Java. So we are still trying to do it better, and we might need some help with, I don't know who knows a lot about the Java. And we will probably try to, unless someone else is going to do it in the meantime. So we're going to maybe do the first PR on that.
Can you refresh my memory what extension we're talking about?
Advanced extension in expression.
Oh, advanced extension in expression.
Yeah.
For
in Spark, what we use it for is to in Spark there is an expression ID, which is, and we also used it to implement aliases.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So the alias name is also in the, so we have both of them right now in the same extension.
Okay.
And then when we see an alias, it's a bit tricky to pass and encode, but it works. So this is how we solve the alias problem.
Yeah, definitely. If there are things that become challenging from the proto, I'd be happy to take a look or whatever. Feel free to send it along, or things that we think we can do better there for allowing that. And I think a standard extension for aliases, as well as things like for output types and stuff like that, would be useful to add as still extensions, but like either a cookbook or some kind of, something to help, because these questions, you're not the first person to ask for this. And so having some kind of something to point to when people want aliases would be useful.
Yeah, one of the weaknesses of the current model of extension, which you kind of are going to run across if you try to introduce standard extensions, is that extensions aren't designed as an array of, say, advanced extensions. It's unadvanced extension. It's like a single proto. And so it's kind of hard to have a combination of custom and standard extensions. Or like, it's not hard, it's just kind of awkward, I guess I would say. There's a question of whether or not it makes sense to switch that to an array. So that if, like we create a standard extension for like node ID and a standard extension for alias, people can use those. And so other tools will know what they mean if they happen to see them. There's some benefit to a pattern or something more like that. I don't know. I haven't thought a lot about it, but it's like the concept of a standard extension, besides the sort of weird conflict in the name. I'm not sure how well the current object model makes it usable, I guess I'd say. Anyway, but I think the other thing that you were saying, Matan, is that you're trying to come up with a clean way to express these things in Java. And
so Java, those things, the Java is not aware of. What we've put is an advanced extension in the proto. That's it. What we found hard is to be able to set it for the expression regardless of its type, because the builders are always on the specific type, but we don't care about the type. So we need something like a copy or some from builder, something like that. But we still didn't get to the bottom of it, so we'll do that. In terms of
so my suggestion there was going to be is that even if you just do a prototype, like I don't know that anybody will look at it, but I think Victor's been doing a lot in the Java stuff. Yeah. So he's been, I think, doing some good work at extending some stuff. So he might have some ideas there.
Yeah. So once we like know what we're doing, so we will ask him probably. In terms of the proto, it's very simple. It's just like advanced extension. And it might be that the Java does not need anything. Almost like just the generated would be enough. What we need to see, and then once it's ready, we will go to Victor.
Yeah. Well, the thing that we were going to do, that I'm not sure what the status is in the Java stuff is that we wanted to make it so that anything that was extendable had like an extendable interface in Java. So if you wanted to add an extension to something, or if you want to extract extension from something, it's always a standardized thing. So the idea would be is that then you construct whatever type you have, and then you just say like, and then take that object and say, oh, it's extendable. Let me just set the node ID or the alias or whatever it is you want to add on top, something like that. But that was the original vision in the Java layer was like, hey, let's just have an interface that everything that's extendable has the same interface for use.
It's another concept of copying, because what you have to do in the alias thing is you want to get the alias, so you get the alias child, right? The expression underneath, and you need to create the expression for that. And on top of that, you need to add the extension. Okay. After it's already built, that's the problem. Because there's no because of the fact that there is no alias node, right? So you need to combine the alias and the child to one node in Substrate. So this is kind of what makes it hard, but we just have to see if we find the next solution.
See what you come up with, share it, and maybe some other people have some ideas.
Yeah, but it's more in Substrate Spark and not under so in the Java and in the Proto, it should be pretty straightforward anyway.
Cool. Very good. Well, I think we scared everybody else off.
Yeah.
All right. Well, have a good evening. Talk to you later.
Bye, guys.